Well, Your Honor, welcome to the Nixon Library. It is a real honor to have any justice of the Supreme Court with us, but particularly you, sir. And I want to welcome you back. So thank you for being here.
Well, it is so great to be in the Western United States again. Though I have to say, this replica of the East Room brings back a little PTSD. When I was introduced to the country at my nomination, it was in the East Room, and I think I was photographed in more in 1 minute than I had been in my entire lifetime.
That's not surprising.
Yeah.
Your book, Overruled, is timely, and it is refreshing because it talks about a lot of stories. You use it to highlight stories of regular Americans who are just trying to live their lives, but they find themselves dealing with the government. Your Honor, don't take this the wrong way, but I can't say that the stories or the circumstances in Overruled make me particularly optimistic about our long-term priorities of several of our country's institutions. So, am I wrong? And let me start by asking, take us through why you wrote the book from 30,000 feet.
All right. Well, I'm optimistic, and I want to make that clear, and I hope
Good.
we get a chance to talk about that.
Good.
All right? I'm hugely optimistic for this country. But why did I write this book? I'll tackle that one first. I've been a judge now for about 18 years, and I had just seen so many cases come through my courtroom where ordinary Americans, hardworking, decent people, were caught up in, they're just getting whacked by laws that they didn't expect and that they shouldn't have reasonably been able to expect. And you know, that's an anecdotal experience, and I just wanted to study further. You know, am I right? Is this just me? Am I missing something? And so I spent some time with Janie Nitze, my co-author and one of my former law clerks, and one of the most remarkable young women you'll ever meet. Family escaped communism, Prague, 1968. Loves this country more than anyone, as immigrants often do. And what we found was, I wasn't wrong. If anything, if you'd fact-checked me, I'd understated the problem in my own mind. And having dug into it, we sat down and we wrote this book about it. And it took us 4 years to do it, and it's delighted to be able to talk to you about it and come out and hear you all.
Well, thank you, sir. Let's dive into the book. Let's start with the growth of the administrative state, to which you devote a lot of attention in Overruled. You write that, and I'm paraphrasing, but you write that once upon a time, not too long ago in America, neighbors helped neighbors solve problems. Associations and clubs were the social fabric of America's communities. Essentially, local challenges were solved by local solutions. This is called federalism. It's the concept of federalism in action. And in fact, you write in the book, quote, "It is through this active participation in our government that we learn and pass along from generation to generation the habits required to sustain our democratic experiment." But today we see a nationalization of problems, local problems that are being solved at the federal level. Walk us through how executive agencies of the federal government grew so big and became involved in such seemingly trivial things such as magic acts and orchid growth.
Yeah, well, maybe when this started coming to my mind, I'm sitting on the 10th Circuit, Federal Court of Appeals. Case comes before me from New Mexico in my circuit. 7th grader. He traded burps for laughs. Now, you might have been guilty of that someday too. I probably was. And instead of going to the principal's office or his parents being called, he was arrested and handcuffed. That's how we're dealing with these things today. And we'll get into why. But what is the scope of the problem? It's part of its administrative actions for sure, but it's on all levels. We're all guilty of it, all right? 100 years ago, the entire federal code could fit into one slim volume. Today, it occupies a whole wall in my office, all right? It's doubled in size since the 1980s, all right? That's my lifetime, many of you in this room. How many criminal laws are there on the books? Nobody knows. In the Reagan administration, somebody sat down to try and read them all and to count them, and they're just scattered throughout. They gave up estimated around 3,000, all right? Today, it's probably double that. It's at least 5,000 criminal laws today on the federal level. What about regulatory output? Because really, statutory output's just the tip of the iceberg. You think Congress isn't busy? Did you know that on average, they enact laws amounting to 2 to 3 million new words every year? Okay. Federal regulatory output, many, many times that. 100 years ago, the Federal Register, which is where they write their rules and publish them, was 16 pages long in the year it started. Recently, it averages 60 to 70,000 pages every single year. How many crimes are in those regulations? Truly, nobody knows the answer to that, but there are at least 300,000 of them. So that's kind of the scope of the growth of law in just really my lifetime, since about 1970. There are more people serving life sentences today in our prisons than there were serving any sentence in 1970. So 1 out of 47 Americans is subject to some form of correctional supervision today. That's all new. That's not the New Deal. That's our lifetimes. So that's what I wanted to really explore and write about, and how it impacts our liberties, our institutions, and maybe even our respect for law itself, right? What respect do you have for something that you can't understand, that you can't comply with, that you didn't know about? Is that different than respecting rules that you know intuitively are right?
And you lay a lot of this at the feet of Woodrow Wilson. Why?
Well, Woodrow Wilson did many great and wonderful things, but he also had great skepticism for our 3 branches of government. He believed that kind of the Madisonian structure of our government, you know, separation of powers. We have 3 branches, supposed to be 3. A third of Americans can't name them. 60% of Americans are estimated that they would fail the citizenship exam that my wife took. It's not hard. Now, filling out the paperwork to become a citizen is very hard. I know because I tried and it got sent back, all right? Think about that. I'll never live that one down at home either. Well, at any rate, you know, Woodrow Wilson believed that the ideal thing we should do is allow experts to govern us instead of democracy, right? And his ideal was the Prussian bureaucracy. Now think about that. Prussian bureaucracy as your model for government, all right? And I don't doubt experts have a very important role to play in an increasingly complex world. They do. But one thing our founders knew is that no men are angels. None of us is perfect. We all have our flaws. And the way to deal with that is to counterbalance power against power, as Madison put it, balance power against power, and bring to bear all ideas and debate and discussion. And that there is more wisdom in this room than in any single head, right? You might call it the wisdom of the masses, we call it today. Francis Galton, who is a cousin of Charles Darwin, put it this way. He went to a county fair in England, and there was a guess the weight of the ox contest. And he looked at all the guesses by the experts, and then he averaged up all the guesses by the ordinary people. And he found that the average of the guesses by the ordinary people was closer than any guess by the experts. And that's how our system of government was designed, right? Was that we would make our laws in the legislature, where our representatives come together and they debate. They disagree, they hash it out, and the best ideas we trust will emerge from that process. And that's something that I think that Woodrow Wilson didn't value enough. He denigrated democracy and said we need a 4th branch of government, or really, in his mind, maybe one superior branch of government. And I'm not here to second guess that we need expertise in our world, but there is another kind of wisdom that we can forget about too. And I think Daniel Halberstam put it maybe in a way that we can all relate to. He's relating a story of Lyndon Johnson talking to Sam Rayburn, then Speaker of the House, at the beginning of the Kennedy administration. And Johnson's bragging on all of Kennedy's appointees. They all went to Harvard, they all have PhDs, one's brighter than the next. And Sam Rayburn replies, yeah, that's great, but I wish one of them, just one of them, had run for sheriff.
You write in Overruled about poor George Norris. He just wanted to grow his orchids, but his home was raided by federal agents for importing orchids without proper documentation. 37 boxes of his possessions were taken away, and only 5 months after all of that happened did he learn what he was under investigation for. What does this say about our society and our society's priorities today and those of federal prosecutors?
Yeah, so this is, I tell this in this book is through stories, really, right? I mean, isn't that how we relate to the world and understand one another? And these are stories of cases I've faced or my friends in the federal judiciary have faced and told me about, some of them. George Norris, at any rate, he loved orchids, and he turned his hobby into his business. And one day, you're absolutely right, his wife's at home, and his home is surrounded by agents. They have no idea what's going on, and they come in and they completely ransack the place, and they question the neighbors, do you know what illegal activity has been going on in that house? He's growing orchids. He is arrested. He has no idea why. It takes, as you say, months before he even finds out the charges against him. And that's not entirely unusual in our system. He winds up serving in prison, and his life is just ruined by it. I mean, he's destroyed by it, as you can imagine. He even served some time in solitary confinement. During a period when he wasn't, he's in with a couple of inmates, and they say, orchids. What do? Smoke them?
There is a such thing as prosecutorial discretion. You know, we recognize that prosecutors can wield immense power, so it is expected that they wrestle with a number of considerations before charging someone with a crime. This George Norris situation, I guess using it as an example, might this be a one-off? Or how serious is a problem, how serious a problem is prosecutorial overreach, and what should be done about it?
Well, when you have so many laws on the books that they say, professors who study this issue say that every one of you has committed a felony. Anyone over the age 18 in the room, at least. And then you say, well, come on, professor, you gotta be joking, right? No, I'm absolutely serious. Every single one of you could be a federal felon, all right? When the laws are written so broadly, and there are so many of them that cover so much of your life, rather than knowing what your responsibilities are, and a prosecutor going after pursuing laws, you can target people, right? And then you can find the law, because it's always there. And so prosecution becomes a matter of discretion, rather than I'm pursuing legal violations when I find them, all right? Now, I don't think we're quite in Stalin's world, but his police chief used to say, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. And can I tell Aaron Schwartz's story
Please.
here? So, the young man, this is kind of an example of what I'm talking about. Young man in his 20s, become a millionaire, tech millionaire. Reddit, he helped start that. Really a brilliant kid. He really believed in public access to published materials. And if you've ever heard of JSTOR, they bring together old journals, and it's a place where you can get academic works. And he believed that some of that material should be in the public domain, and he copied it with the intent to put it on the internet with free access rather than having to go behind a paywall. Well, maybe he should have done that, maybe not. People can disagree. JSTOR got wind of this. He gave all the stuff back. As far as they were concerned, that was the end of the story. We're talking about things like a 1942 edition of the Journal of Botany, all right? Federal prosecutors, however, despite JSTOR saying they don't want charges pressed, brought charges against this young man. They offered him a plea deal of 4 to 6 months in prison. He said, I am not a federal felon. I don't think I did anything wrong, and I'm not going to agree to that plea deal. What was the prosecutor's response? They brought more charges against him as punishment for refusing the plea deal effectively, at least in his eyes. So now, rather than face 4 to 6 months in prison, he faced potentially decades in prison. Well, the fortune he had earned was evaporated soon in lawyers' fees. We can talk about that too, if you want. And 3 months before trial, he killed himself. And afterwards, the prosecutor released a press release saying that they thought they had done nothing wrong. Today, about 94, 97% of cases in our criminal justice system are resolved through plea deals. That wasn't true, again, in 1970. This is a new development in our lifetimes. And it has some pluses and it has some minuses. The pluses, it's cheaper, it's easier, it's quicker, all right? The minuses, I think, are obvious from a case like Aaron Schwartz. There's no check on the prosecutor, right? There's also no check on the judge, honestly. Juries are supposed to be the check on judges and prosecutors in our system. They bring to bear the ordinary and common sense wisdom of the masses, if you want, right? This is ridiculous, we're not gonna do it, all right? The framers believed in juries so deeply they put it at least 3 places in our Constitution. Article 3, the 6th Amendment, and the 7th Amendment. And yet we hardly use juries anymore. And that's kind of the negative consequence you see in cases like George Norris.
Yeah.
and Aaron Schwartz.
Yeah. Let's keep going on criminal law, because you write about the growth of criminal law. You give some pretty funny examples, but they're very real. You say that you cannot sing the national anthem as part of a medley in the state of Massachusetts. Did everybody know that? You can't do that.
That's true.
In Virginia, you cannot hunt a bear with dogs on Sundays.
On Sundays.
Only Sundays. Only Sundays. No, seriously, there are an estimated 56 new federal crimes created every year. You quote an attorney and a journalist called Harvey Silvergate, who says that every American commits 3 felonies every day. And most of the time, they do it without even knowing that they're doing so. So you pose the question in the book, what happens when the criminal law grows so much that it no longer reflects just everyday institutions, but holds even seemingly ordinary conduct unlawful? What are we to do about that?
Well, what I'm worried about here, why does this matter? I mean, there's some funny stories, there's some sad stories. But when law grows so much, I worry about a few things. And really, they're nothing new. They're things James Madison warned us against, believe it or not. That's why he made lawmaking so difficult, right? And separated powers so much. He knew a few things. One, your liberties are at risk when there's a law against everything, because then again, it becomes the prosecutor's discretion. Number 2, there's an equality problem that emerges. Who's gonna find their way through the maze best? It's gonna hurt everybody, but who's got the means to find their way, hire the fancy lawyers and figure it out? It's gonna be the moneyed and the connected few, all right? Madison wrote that. It's there. He warned us against it. Governor Morris said nothing is to be feared more than the excess of law. They worried about that. That's why they made the lawmaking process difficult, and why you shouldn't complain about it being difficult. You should rejoice in that fact, right? It hurts the ordinary person far more than the rich and the connected. And then finally, a third thing. We love our institutions. We love this country. And we should love the rule of law because it's one of the greatest gifts we have in this country, right? But what happens to your respect for law when everybody's a criminal? When you live in fear, right? Caligula, Roman emperor, used to insist, he had written law too. They had written laws, but he wrote it in a hand so small and posted it on columns so high nobody could read him. And he did that deliberately so that people would live in fear. And do we want to fear our institutions and fear our law, or do we want to revere our institutions and love our law? So those are the questions and things I worry about at the end of the day from the book.
Do you think that the government is deliberately impeding on individual liberty today, or are we simply seeing the effects of unintentional incompetence, or is it something else entirely?
No, I think this is all done with the best of intentions, right? But Brandeis, Justice Brandeis said, I think it was Brandeis, who said, worry most when the government's acting with the best of intentions. I think Ronald Reagan, didn't he? He said the words Americans fear most, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. Right? No, it's always done with the best of intentions. And we want our government to make us safe. We want the government to keep us healthy. How far does that go? That's the question I ask.
You write in the book, quote, these days, federal agencies don't just enforce the laws that Congress writes, they also engage in activities that look a lot like legislating and judging. Unpack that for us. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so we have Congress that's supposed to make our laws. We all know that. We learned that from Schoolhouse Rock, right? You remember the Schoolhouse Rock video where they talk about the railroad crossing? There's the bill finally becomes a law. It's all about a railroad crossing. I love Schoolhouse Rock. I wish they still showed it. It's wrong. There is no such law. It's in a federal regulation, okay? So what Congress has done is delegated a lot of its lawmaking responsibility to agencies. And the agencies write the rules and the criminal laws, as we talked about a moment ago, themselves. So they kind of act as a quasi-legislature, all right? Just what, by the way, Wilson wanted for us, all right? They not only write the laws effectively, they then, of course, act as the prosecutor. They bring charges against people, and then they judge the people as well who come before them, all right? If you have a license, any state licensing regime, I'm sure the state licensing lawyers know all about this. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads, all right? This is how it works. Now, we're not moving away from crime. This is civil mostly. And what does an adjudication before one of those judges look like? How does it differ? And again, these are good people trying their very best. But it's what happens when you don't separate powers and you consolidate them in one place, right? You have somebody, the same people who write the rules, then decide to prosecute you. They single you out, and then they bring you before one of their own employees to judge you. That person might be called an administrative judge or an administrative law judge. They used to not long ago be called hearing officers, but now they like to wear robes. God bless them. You know. The problem is many of them can be fired if their superiors don't like their decisions. And even ones that have some modicum of independence by statute or rule still tend to rule in favor of their agencies far more often than judges in court do. And that's documented, and the statistics are in the book. Also, before that administrative law judge, you don't get a jury. That's gone. That essential check is gone as well. And you don't get all the same procedural rights that you would in court, like the right to cross-examine your accuser. You know, another one that appears in our Constitution, pretty fundamental, right? In a lot of agencies, an administrative law judge or an administrative judge can simply say, yes, normally that would be a good idea. Maybe I'll allow it, maybe I won't. But this piece of paper from the agency official who charged you it's reliable enough. We don't need to have crossing. We can dispense with that. So it's a very different system. And if you think it doesn't matter to you, Professor Jonathan Turley estimates that the average American is 10 times more likely to wind up appearing in front of an administrative judge than a judge in a court of law today.
So on the subject of federal administration, I'll ask you to indulge me by answering a Nixon question, because we're here in the Nixon Library. And actually, an interesting note of historical significance, today is the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's resignation. As his legacy is being reevaluated, literally today, 50 years on, we recognize that a significant expansion of the federal administration occurred during the Nixon years. I will wager that this is a case of good expectations that ballooned into something that he never could or would have imagined. Because there were real pleas for environmental reform measures in the 1970s and pushes for workplace safety measures. But we might say today that the growth of the federal administration that we saw then and that we are now living with is not exactly what the framers had in mind. Could the initiatives, EPA, OSHA, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, could these have conceivably gone a different way? Could they have been implemented better? Could they be more accountable to the American taxpayer?
Listen, I am not looking to roll back to 1789. That's not the argument I'm making in the book. I'm just asking for maybe a dose of common sense along the way. Let's take a NOAA case. John and Sandra Yates are a couple who fell in love, high school sweethearts, lived up in Lake Erie, moved down to Florida, be near family, and also John wanted to be a fisherman. That was his lifelong passion. He worked his way up from a deckhand to captain of his own small crew, three-man boat. They're out one day fishing for red grouper. They have a guy who comes up, flashes a badge, and he's a state official, but he's cross-deputized with NOAA.
Yeah.
And he says, I'd like to measure your fish. And John says, I have several thousand pounds of red grouper in the hold. Agent says, I have all day. He starts measuring the fish. Now, 20 inches was the limit. You had to be above 20 inches. And he's measuring them, and he finds 72 out of the whole lot that he thinks are less than 20 inches. All of them are above 18 inches. Most of them are above 19, but there are 72. Now, John doesn't think this fellow knows how to measure a red grouper, by the way, because he's measuring to the nose. But red grouper have a long lower jaw. And John says, you're missing the lower jaw. At any rate, 72 it is. And he says, put them in a crate, and I'll deal with you when you come back to shore a few days later. John puts them dutifully in the crate, comes back to shore a few days later. Guy's there to meet him again, and he does his measuring again. This time he comes up with 69 that are undersized. Now he's very suspicious. There's a discrepancy there. Now John thinks, hey, red grouper go into cold holds and out on hot decks. They expand, they contract, and you're not a very good measurer of red grouper anyway. But at any rate, he doesn't hear anything more about it for 3 years. 3 years later, agents surround his house, all right? He's not home. Sandra, his wife, is doing laundry when she sees agents closing in on her home. Where's John? He's out crabbing. Get him in here. Gets him in here. He doesn't know what's up. It's 3 years. They have no idea. He's arrested, taken 2 hours away to Fort Myers and booked, where he learns he's charged with violating the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Now, the people who are laughing are lawyers, because they know what that is. And it was a law passed after the Enron accounting scandal. And it's designed to prevent accountants from destroying documents when there's a federal investigation going on. And it says something like, thou shalt not destroy accounting records, documents, and other tangible objects, okay? And their theory is, the government's theory, or at least one of them, is that John threw those 72 red grouper overboard and replaced them with 69 still undersized fish, and thereby destroyed tangible objects to impede a federal investigation. John thinks that's about the silliest thing he's ever heard, because if he wanted to throw over and not get caught, he wouldn't, fine, you get it. Sarbanes-Oxley violation can land you 20 years in federal prison. He fought that charge. He rejected, like Aaron Schwartz, a plea deal. He went to trial and he lost. The judge only sentenced him to 30 days in jail, but it was over Christmas. He and Sandra were busy raising 2 grandchildren at the time. He asked, can I delay it till after? Nope, in Christmas it was. He was ready to give up at that point, as many of you would be. He'd served his time, he's out of the industry. I mean, there's no going back to being a commercial fisherman after that. And he's pretty dejected. But Sandra won't have any of it. She is a remarkable woman and maybe the heroine of this book. And she insists on fighting it, and they fight it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they win. They win by 1 vote. And Sandra, to this day, is still angry about that. She thinks she should have gotten 9-0. But that's what winning can look like in our system. They won, think about it, they won the vindication from the highest court of the land, all the vindication a man can receive in our legal system. And they still lost, right? Their lives were turned upside down. He's unemployable in the industry he loves. She has to be the breadwinner till the day she dies, and they now live in a triple-wide trailer. So those are the stories I wanted to tell in this book and get you thinking about.
And it's the first one that you do. John and Sandra Yates is the first story, and it's what got me hooked. So you will all start reading, and you will all be hooked too. Switching gears, let's talk about the dueling concepts of individualism and collectivism. You write in the book that, and I'm paraphrasing, nowadays segments of society put a premium on prioritizing the collective interest over the interests of individuals. So why did our country's framers specifically write about the concept of individualism in our most basic founding documents, and do you think that we're drifting away from that today?
Yeah, the Declaration of Independence, we're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary. And I really hope it's a moment where we can come together like we did in 1976, those of us who remember that. Right after Watergate, after Vietnam, 1976 was a real healing moment for this country, I thought. And I hope we're going to have something like that again. The Declaration has 3 fundamental, remarkable things in it. Proclamations. 1, you have inalienable rights, each and every one of us. And they're endowed by our Creator and not by government. Number 2, we're all created equal. Now, it's taken a long time for us to make progress toward that ideal, but it's there, right? And number 3, the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Those are powerful ideas, and I think they're our nation's kind of report card. And we have to ask ourselves, how are we doing on those things? All the time, all the time. But they've inspired, freedom movements across the globe, right? I mean, you can see them in documents from Czechoslovakia to Vietnam have been inspired by our Declaration, right? Lincoln referred to it all the time during the Civil War. How are we doing on that equality promise? So did Dr. King, right? So did the women at Seneca Falls. All men and women are created equal, they wrote, right? So I do think we have to ask ourselves individually, how are we doing? And one of the questions I have in the book is, why are we appealing so much to these collective impulses, this law, as our solution for everything? And I think it has something to do, and I'm not a psychologist or a social scientist, but I can't help but it has something to do with how we view one another, right? If I trust and respect you to make good decisions for yourself and your family, I don't need rules to tell you how to do it. If I trust myself to make good decisions, if I trust my local community, if we can make things happen together, we don't need law, right? Tocqueville, when he came to this country in the 1830s, marveled that great initiatives would be undertaken by British lords in England or by a government in France, that they were being done by ordinary citizens just coming together in this country through charities, hospitals, educational institutions, just working together. And he said that was kind of the secret sauce of America as he saw it. And what he worried for us is, what happens if Americans become too caught up in their own private affairs and less interested in working with others to solve our collective problems? And he saw a potential future for us in which we stop interacting with one another. We start leaving one another alone. And when all those kinds of familiar associations, church, the Elks Club, the Rotary Club, your bridge night, your poker, give way to online Wordle, online gambling, social isolation, bowling alone, as Robert Putnam put it, right? that we become more distrustful of our neighbor. We don't trust them. We need somebody else to answer. We need new associations. We need new affiliations. And we find them at the state. We find them at the state level. And he said, he feared for us that we might all become a timid flock of sheep looking for a shepherd. And I'm not saying we're there yet, but you do have to wonder when young people today, a third of them will say it's not particularly important to live in a democracy. When people can't name the three branches of government and don't know why they're there. When more and more Americans report that the people in the opposing political party are not just wrong, fair enough, but that they're evil, right? It's one thing to debate and disagree. We have to be able to do that in a democracy. Yeah. That is, again, the wisdom of the masses, the idea that we can all debate, disagree, decide, and then move on. But when we don't just disagree, but hate the person on the other side, want to hurt the person on the other side, then the whole thing falls apart, doesn't it? Yeah.
Talk to us, one of my favorite stories in the book is about the monks of the St. Joseph Abbey in Louisiana. Tell us their story.
So this is a story about what's called regulatory capture, all right? And one interesting phenomenon economists have observed is that when you create these regulatory institutions that aren't democratically accountable immediately, what happens? Who's most interested in how that agency works? It's going to be the people who it regulates, right? And that they will often wind up moving in and out of that agency, and maybe even controlling or capturing the agency, and that they like to create barriers to entry that make it harder for other people to enter the market. Okay, so we talk about that in the book, and the story tells the monks of St. Joseph's Abbey in Louisiana. They run a monastery. What do they have to do with the law, right? Truth is, before Hurricane Katrina, they'd sell some trees. They lived in a swamp. They'd sell some trees, and that's how they made their living. But after the hurricane, that was a problem. A lot of trees were gone, so they were looking for something new to kind of sustain themselves, and they decided, well, we're pretty good at building caskets. The monks die, they build a very plain casket, and they said, maybe we should get in the casket business. And, you know, we could offer a pretty good deal on caskets because we make a pretty basic casket and we'll bless it for you and give you a good price. And it turned out they were really successful at it. But there's something in Louisiana called the Funeral Directors and Embalmers Agency.
Board of Embalmers and Funeral Directors, yes.
Yeah, there you go. Guess who runs that, right? The funeral directors. Guess what they don't like? Price competition from monks. And they went after the monks. And they had investigations done of them. And they go to funerals and take pictures of the caskets, these illegal caskets, before they could be buried and the evidence destroyed. I'm not making it up. Sarbanes, yeah. Anyway, the monks fought this for years. Their story has a happy ending. At the end of the day, they were allowed in the industry. But that's the sort of thing I'm talking about in the book.
I love that line, that before, they had to get to him before any evidence could be buried.
Yeah, and you know, what are the funeral directors, you know, what was their nominal concern? Their nominal concern was, well, you don't have a parlor, a funeral parlor, and you don't have an embalming facility. And the monks were like, whoa, we're not interested in running a funeral parlor or an embalming facility. We're just selling caskets. And no, they didn't want them in. They were afraid of more competition.
So one of your chapters in the book is called The Forgotten Americans. And what can the forgotten Americans do to overcome challenges like this? Like the monks had?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I was kind of starting at earlier. What do we do about this, right? One old guy in Washington can't do this. 9 old people in Washington can't do this. It's not going to be a top-down solution, I don't think. I really think it has to come from you. And I hate to give you a homework assignment. But it is we the people, those are the first 3 words of the Constitution. and you are the sovereign in this country. And if you don't care, it ain't gonna happen. Nothing's gonna change. But it is amazing what ordinary people can do to affect change, right? I was just at the Reagan Library, and they have a piece of the Berlin Wall. That was the people, right? They decided they didn't want to live like that anymore, right? And I do think we have to learn how to talk with one another again, right? And realize a person with whom we disagree loves his country every bit as much as we do. And we have to teach, I think we're gonna have to teach how to talk in our schools, right? So that people can hear one another. At campuses today, kids, huge numbers of them say it's okay to silence speakers with whom they disagree. We can't have that, right? Democracy doesn't work without debate. And then we have to teach civics again. Bad word in some quarters. But I don't see how you can understand and appreciate our system of government if you don't understand some basic things, right? Like why we have three, not just that we have three branches, but why they're different. Why are judges unelected? That's an important question. Why do we have two houses of Congress? Why is it so difficult to legislate? What is the president supposed to do, and what isn't the administrative branch supposed to do? And I think when people understand what gift we've been given, then we can have a dialogue that'll work and address some of these problems. But I think it starts in our schools, and I think it starts in our homes. And I think it's up to you. And if you don't care, nothing will change. If you do, it's amazing how much change even a single person can affect. I mean, look at Sandra Yates and what she did. And she did it because she didn't want what happened to her husband happen to others.
Yeah, no, to your point about civics, I will say that the Nixon Foundation is doing our part to rectify the civics problem, and it's a very real problem, through our American Civics Campaign, which is an effort that we launched about this time last year to reintroduce civics education at a very basic level, and we're already starting to see the effects. So I think, as you and I were talking about earlier, presidential libraries and community centers can really be a series of change agents to combat this issue.
They absolutely can. And I go around the country, and I talk about some of them in the book.
Yeah.
Places like this, places like all of the presidential libraries, the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, iCivics that was founded by Justice O'Connor, one of my predecessors, to teach civics in middle school and do it through games, video games. They're actually wonderful. I played them with fifth graders with Justice Sotomayor. They're fantastic. So there's a ton people can do, yeah.
Well, let's close this conversation in the way that we started. I'm coming around to see that these are stories of optimism. And you said that you are an optimist. You write in the book that you're an optimist. That's the way that you close the book. Give our audience some parting words of wisdom as to why.
Well, I'll give you some reasons why I'm optimistic. So Isis Brantley, you'll read her story in the book. She's a hair braider in Texas, put out of business because she didn't have a barber's license. Okay, again, agents raided her salon, put her out of business. And she said, why? Now, barber's license takes 3 years to get, costs a lot of money. She didn't have it. She was homeless for a period, single mother. And she fought that. And she, now barber's license, what would you learn about hair braiding in a barber school? It turns out absolutely nothing in the curriculum has to do with hair braiding. She fought that and finally got back into business. And then they tried to stop her from teaching other people. She loved to teach other women how to hair braid, to help support their families. And they said, well, now you need a license for that too. You have to have a barber's teaching license for that, different license. And you don't have enough stations and facilities. And she's like, well, again, I just use my hands. I don't use any tool. She fought that. It took her 20 years. And she won. She won. And people like that have caused Texas and other states to rethink their licensing regimes. And hair braiding no longer requires a license in Texas, for example, all right? Idaho, by its legislature, abolished its entire administrative code, except for those provisions the governor deemed essential. Texas now has a sunset provision, eliminating agencies after a set period of time unless they're affirmatively reauthorized. So there are people working on these things across the country, and you can do it too. And I know you're saying, well, what about the federal government? Do we have any reason for hope there? And I do. And let me tell you a story of my friend Steve Breyer, my former colleague. Before he was a justice on the Supreme Court, he was an aide in the Senate to Teddy Kennedy in the 1970s. And they looked into the airline industry, and what they saw was a centralized, top-down regulatory regime, the Civil Aeronautics Board, it was called. And to start a new airline, you had to have the government's permission. And to even offer a new route, you had to have the government's permission. And if you wanted to change your fares, you had to have the government's permission. So who benefited from that regime? The incumbent airlines, right? They loved it. Turns out, when they held hearings, the only people who liked the current regime was the board and the airlines. And that got Steve Breyer thinking, well, maybe something should change. And a bunch of economists told him it would be impossible to change because of regulatory capture, because of this triangle of interests. And he said, well, that's not going to stop me from trying. And you know what? On a bipartisan basis signed by Jimmy Carter, they eliminated the entire agency. And that's why you can fly today. So many Americans can fly today. Used to be very expensive when I was a child. Very few people could take to the skies. Now we all do. Now, you got to pay a lot of money for your bags, and we're all cramped. So it's uncomfortable. It used to be a lot more comfortable, but everybody can do it. So it can be a bipartisan thing. This is not a right-left thing. I mean, President Trump had a 2-for-1 rule. You put in a regulation, you got to get rid of 2. President Obama started that kind of idea in his time too. 2012, in his State of the Union address, he complained about overregulation. He said that he understood when it came to salmon, for example, that the Interior Department regulated them when they're in fresh water, the Commerce Department when they're in salt water, and it got even more complicated when they got smoked. The fact checkers went to work on it, thinking maybe he had overstated it, and rated it as mostly true because he undersold the complexity of regulation of salmon. So it can be something we can all work on together.
So let's go forward as a room full of optimists. Your Honor, thank you. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.